As you're well aware, we're living in unprecedented times. Join us now for today's special program.
I want to spend my life mending broken people. I want to spend my life removing pain. Lord, let my words heal a heart that hurts. I want to spend my life mending broken people. I want to spend my life mending broken people.
Well, hello, friends. Welcome to that time of year. Just a few days from now, our nation will be celebrating Independence Day, or always known as July 4th. And therefore, we are at that time of year where we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, religious liberty, religious freedom, all the things that politically and religiously impact not only our nation, but the Church of God in every particular of the world, as well as more specifically here in America. And I've tried to dress for the occasion, red, white, and blue, to try to seem patriotic, but my allegiance, to be very candid with you, is sold out to Jesus Christ. But I live here in America, and I'm very much a citizen of this country, and I'm very much aware of where we are. And I have a guest today with me that thrills my soul whenever we get together. I always wonder, Lincoln, should we get a fire extinguisher when we get together? Because
why put it out? Let's
our topics are hot topics.
Let's throw some Bible text and current events on it and get it to burn a little more.
Yes, Lincoln Steed of Liberty Magazine, Liberty Insider, all those things that have to do with the politics and religion of what's happening in our church and in our nation. We're going to have an interesting 2-hour program. You might want to hit the record button right now, because I tell you, you're going to hear things that you might say, can you rewind that, and you'll realize you didn't record it. So you might want to do that now. Or at the end of the program, you might say, I need a copy of that, and you'll contact 3ABN for a DVD version, or maybe you'll go to the internet and we'll tell you about all of those things and how to get a copy of that. But before we dive into this very informative and thought-provoking program, we want to have some music. And I can tell you, this is the time of year where prophecy and politics and religion and economy and the things happening in our world are merging together at such an alarming rate that we've got to keep our minds focused. And this song, one of my favorite ones that Pastor Wintley Phipps sang here, and it's called The Glorious Church. Listen to the descriptive message of what's happening in our world today and how Babylon is coming together. I know you're going to be blessed. Right after this, we'll be right back and dive into an exciting program.
After these things I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, a prison for every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partakers of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. The shining Jew of the ancient world, Babylon worshipped gods of stone. Power and pride were evil twins that ruled her heart and throne. She was likened to a harlot. Fornication was in the wine that filled the cup from which she drank, sins of every kind. The golden head of Daniel's vision would topple given time, as would nations, kings, and merchants intoxicated by her wine. The prophets tried to warn her, heed the writing on the wall, turn from her wicked ways before the day the wrath of God would fall. Oppressor of God's people, Babylon so powerful and strong, she thought she was invincible, but God would prove her wrong. An angel filled with glory shall descend with a shout proclaim, Babylon the great is fallen, she will die in sin and shame. Another voice from heaven will be heard across the earth to give a warning loud and clear to those who claim to be God's church. Come out of her, my people, be not partakers of her sin, for I'm coming back for a glorious church, undefiled and pure within. To him who worships me in spirit and truth and is faithful to the end, I will say, well done, a crown of life you won. Come sit and reign with me throughout eternity. Thus saith the Lord. To him who worships me in spirit and truth and is faithful to the end, I will say, well done, a crown of life you won. Come sit and reign with me throughout eternity. Thus saith the Lord. For thine is the kingdom
Thank you, Pastor Phipps. That's always an energetic song, don't you think so, Lincoln?
Absolutely.
You know, what I like about that song,
A rousing song.
A rousing song. It's saying to us, in spite of what we see happening in our world, and even in light of what's happening in our world, God is preparing for a glorious church. So at the very outset of this program, we're going to talk about many, many issues. But I want to thank you for your prayers and your financial support of this network as we continue going and growing, getting ready for the coming of the Lord. But to say the least, we are living in a very volatile climate today. On one side, we have issues on COVID-19, wear a mask or don't wear a mask. On the other side, we have issues of racial injustice and inequality, that clarion call. In the middle, we have political expediency or no political expediency. We have the merging of church and state. So many volatile issues today. And we're going to try to delicately deal with some of these issues. So please try to refrain from pigeonholing us into any particular political category, because these issues that are confronting America today are pertinent to the church glorious nature. His church is going to triumph regardless of what's happening today. But in the context of religious liberty, it's important for the people of God to know where to stand at an hour where you're being told where to stand, and why it is important to remain and keep your allegiance in the program of Christ. So, Lincoln, good to have you here.
Wonderful to be here. And with this emphasis on the upbeat, let me just add something that I may have mentioned before, but probably not on this program. My father's been dead a few years. You know, he was one of the old-style Seventh Adventists, a leader eventually at the General Conference. And in his retirement, in my present job, I would call up from time to time and tell him some of these apocalyptic, literally, developments. And I don't know what I was after. Maybe I was wanting to, have him shake in his boots or whatever. And he only had one response. He was a very upbeat person, and he would always say, "Isn't it exciting?" He says, "The Lord's about to come."
Amen.
And really, that needs to be the overall statement on anything that we bring out about where we are now in the U.S. and in prophecy. There's fearful events taking place.
Right.
But the excitement is that we're moving quickly, and beyond it is the eternal kingdom with the Lord in eternal security with the untold, unnumbered redeemed from all ages and all places.
You know, I heard a story about a guy that he decided to walk from one coast to the next. He went to set a record, what they call that's a Guinness Book of Records. And they asked him, they said, "At what point did you decide, or did you ever think of quitting?" And they said, "Was it the rain?" He said, "No." "Was it the cold nights?" He said, "No, I expected that." "Was it the storms that just inadvertently would pop up?" "Was it the high mountains?" He said, "No." He said, "It was the sand in my shoes." And so a lot of these issues are the sand in our shoes. True. We have to keep in mind that in our journey to the coming of the Lord, there's going to be mountains and hills and valleys and rain and storm. But nothing can irritate you more than the thing that interrupts the way we walk as Christians. And a lot of these issues, we don't want to relegate them to so minor a place as sand in our shoes. But when you think about where we're headed, Lincoln, sometimes we could let the sand in our shoes get us off the road.
Well, it's because we're human and we're emotional. And if your energy's low, like even Elijah, remember, he just had the experience on Mount Carmel. It must have been an emotional drain.
Yes.
And a few hours later, he's running for his life, doesn't want to live. I'm the only one. Let me die, Lord.
Yes.
I mean, that was unfortunate, but God didn't damn him for it.
No.
But it was what we humans are subject to. But we need to keep our spirits up. And of course, the Bible says, encourage each other with these words.
That's right, encourage one another. So the question is appropriate as you brought the Elijah context. What doest thou here? What are we doing here? Absolutely. What is the church doing here in these last days? Before we go into that, let the people that may be watching for the first time and don't know who you are, establish your credentials. I know who you are.
Well, I'm an ordained pastor of the Seventh Adventist Church. Okay. I'm a long-time editor, and for 20 years been editing our church's religious liberty journal called Liberty. It's been published continuously under that title since 1906, but as the Sentinel, it goes back to essentially the beginnings of Seventh Adventism in the even a bit before the 1880s, with a grand hero of Adventism, Alonzo T. Jones, who put himself on the map for our church, and I think prophetically, by successfully opposing an incipient national Sunday law in the United States. Right. That was unambiguously to stop all activity except church-going on the Sabbath on pain of law. On the Sunday,
That's right.
Sunday Sabbath, according to the people that had it wrong. But even if, as I've told people, if you understand religious liberty, even if the US or any country were bold enough to enforce seventh-day Sabbath observance, it would still be wrong.
That's right.
That's a key to understanding religious liberty. If people are forced against their will and conscience to do something, it's not God's way.
That's right. That's important because people, in America here, this is kind of something I do. I don't know if I'm a geek or whatever you might call it, or just an information vacuum, but I like to know my rights. And I have a copy of the Bill of Rights here, and I have a copy of the Constitution at home. And I remember when I traveled, I was on the plane reading this, and the guy asked me next door, he said, what's that you're reading? Because the book has a very kind of,
I've got that
political
same
look. And he said, what's that you're reading? I said, the Bill of Rights. I said, and so I threw him a question, said, if you were pulled over by an officer, do you know what your response should be? No. I said, you are an American citizen. You should know your rights. And there are many people operating in the paradigm of American citizenry, or in any country for that matter, and even those who are members of churches or denominations, and some of them don't understand their denominational doctrines, some don't understand where they came from.
Yeah.
So liberty, which I like about it, we are looking at not only the signs of the coming of the Lord, but why it's important to maintain everything focusing in that direction.
I should finish your question. I edit Liberty magazine,
right,
and which has been mentioned on this program before, and I have a program on 3ABN. But Liberty magazine itself, begun by the Seventh-day Adventist Church because of its own, the members' own experience and the prophetic understanding of the role of the United States in prophecy and so on. All of that informed the need to talk about religious liberty. But from the beginning, Liberty magazine has been sent out to non-Adventists, but particularly to those that set the tone for our country, legislators, lawyers, mayors, judges.
That's right.
We want these thought leaders to understand the different aspects of religious liberty. And you've held up the Constitution. Thankfully, in the United States, we can appeal to that. You can't in every country.
Right.
That's a good beginning, but there's the history. How did we get that? The role of religious dissidents coming to the United States. So history, the Reformation, and then, of course, theology, prophecy. An Adventist perspective. Not that it's different from all of those, but it sharpens it, and Adventists believe that we're carrying on the Reformation.
That's
we're
right.
carrying on the biblical imperative for religious freedom. And at root, I say this over and over again, if you analyze it, religious liberty is nothing more than the gospel. It's a message of liberation, and that's why Paul says, this gospel of liberty.
That's right.
We have been liberated from sin, and now as a freed individual, it's my duty, my privilege, and my compulsion to share that. And no one can stop that, but they can make it more or less difficult. And so you would like a government who understands this to clear the way for you, not to do it for you. That's church and state.
Right. That's
but the government shouldn't impede it. And the Constitution, I think, accurately accepts that they're not to be in that business. And I think you were going to quote the First Amendment, weren't you?
Oh, yeah, I tell you, we're going to talk about some of the issues that are very paramount here and why, as American citizens, and if you're watching from other parts of the world, why it's important for you to understand if your government offers liberty for worship, why it's important to understand how that and the government, and I like the point you make, and I want to reiterate this, the government should support your freedom to worship, not tell you how to worship.
Right.
That's the liberty that you bring out. So we're going to talk about that in just a moment, but let's just do an overview. The signs of the end. People always talk about signs of the end. What makes 2020 a banner year? Let's go ahead and just dive into this. It's been a year that is so unpredictable.
I just wrote an editorial, and I'm already drawing a parallel, not narrowly between 2020, but this period we're in now. There's an election for the next 4 years, which would kick in 2020. I think it's paralleled in the U.S. history and by some significant events by 1968.
Okay. Let's go ahead and dive into that because there's some
what
people
was happening in 1968. That was the Martin Luther King, who was definitely a visionary in nonviolence like Gandhi. He took his values from Gandhi. And a great wrong was addressed, not finally, but it came a long way with the Civil Rights Movement. Laws were changed. Some attitudes were changed. Martin Luther King was killed. this country was burning. The United States was burning. I was in Washington. I remember the pall rising up from the capital of the most powerful country in the world. There were tens of thousands of National Guard troops and police with riot gear and all the rest. It was a dangerous time. In the foreign war at the time, which was wearing everyone and troubling families whose sons might go. Tet Offensive showed us that we had no chance of winning this thing. So everything was shaking on its foundations. An idealistic potential president, Bobby Kennedy, was shot. There were riots at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. It was a bad year, but again, like this time, the whole structure of the country, not the Constitution itself, but how the vision for an America was being administered, where we were going, what it meant for the average citizen. It was all just reeling and rocking. And I think it could have gone in extremely bad direction. Not everything good happened, but we survived it. And civil rights legislation came out of it. There was a resolution of sorts, but some things were bottled up.
That's right.
And I believe we're now, it's hard to know, there may be even providential elements behind it, but you can sort of trace some reasons, not least of which COVID. It's sort of now the genie's out of the bottle again, and we're back to the future.
Yeah, very good term. We're back to the future, because the things that could have been resolved back then, as you said, were not completely resolved. It was somewhat of a Band-Aid, if you look at it. Right. Things were brought to the forefront, like voting rights and the merging of interracial schools, and that was something that was hesitantly done in the whole '60s era.
And I'll lay another dynamic on where we are now. In 2008, the economy broke. An overly indebted nation. U.S. debt is fantastically high. It's mathematically almost impossible to pay back.
True.
Under normal terms. And yet, because of what you alluded in the pre-discussion to the Bretton Woods Agreement, as the dominant force after World War II, the U.S. basically is the linchpin for the global economy.
True.
And the dollar is the exchange currency. But that can't last.
No.
But as long as it lasts, we can get away with economic murder. And in 2008, the system broke, not fixed. And now with the collapse of the economy, planned or otherwise, as a result of COVID, we are now vulnerable to the consequences of 2008. And it's a matter of history, and prophecy undergirds it. When you break the economy, when you change people's livelihood, and there's unemployed and people just cast adrift, all sorts of social and religious changes will happen very suddenly in a cataclysmic way.
Right. There's a paradigm shift that almost obviously presents itself. That's why that song that Wintley just sang was so significant. It was led into the Babylon, this ancient jewel. But then Revelation says, speaking about Babylon, it goes forth to the kings of the earth, to the merchants of the earth.
Right.
So right now, this whole system, as we know prophetically, called Babylon, this merging of everything that is anti-Christ is coming together, but it's reaching out to the political and leaders of the world and the merchants of the earth.
Absolutely.
To pull itself under, to strengthen its economic and political and religious power. That's the paradigm that we're starting to see happen before us.
I've mentioned it before in talks and something I wrote. There's convergence. There are lines of causality that have been gathering. Economic is one, there's political instability, but they're all coming together.
That's right.
Even environmental degradation, and we don't need to talk much on a July 4 type emphasis, but it's worth remembering that the Pope of Rome, the leader of the old consolidated Christian church that brought in some of the abuses of the Middle Ages, he has a grand plan to save the world from environmental degradation that involves worshipping on the Lord's Day. Happens to think it's Sunday.
Right.
So that's sort of ticking along in the background. So that will soon catch the attention even of leaders in the US at the moment that are naysayers on that. You have economic doomsday coming. You have social dislocation, and I have a great burden that social distancing, necessary as it may seem to avoid contagion, is actually long been a prerequisite for political abuses and despotism. I remember reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn in Russia as a dissident.
Okay.
And that's exactly what that system did to a dissident. They would isolate them to give them the feeling they were by themselves, they had no support, nobody else thought like they did, that this all-powerful government could could just deal with them as it wished.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, looking back on that, it was called isolationism, to hopefully advance an agenda. And I talked about this, when you have this, if I isolate you, and let's go back and to the Dark Ages, that was a time of grand isolation.
Right.
Isolation from the Bible, isolation from any clerical guidance, and everything came from the top down, and so people had to ingest whatever was given to them politically and religiously.
It's hard to have independent thought or initiative without a sense of solidarity. I'm not punning there, the solidarity movement in Poland. But, without having a sense of solidarity, as the early Christians did with their fellow believers, of course, the overwhelming feeling that they were with the Lord, that he was a spiritual presence in their life. But, isolation, and it's not yet totally in the United States, but I am very worried about the phenomenon, and I think it's going to continue. I don't see in the near future we'll go back to shaking hands and hugging and all the rest.
That's right.
And that's toxic.
It is. We actually talked about that once. I was doing some music with one of the gentlemen here, Tim Parton, actually. We were doing music together, and right after, we shook hands, and he said, "Wow, that felt so good. Let's go wash our hands." And I said to him, if I had anything, you would have caught it already. Not to be a person who is buttressing the social distancing aspect, because right now we know the opposite to that is just a conglomeration of people just getting together like mice in a petri dish. Yeah. And unfortunately, that if anybody is affected or infected, somebody has the potential.
Well, we caught it in a catch-22, but it could be possible that it's been over-applied. Like to reflexly close down houses of worship, as we now belatedly are doing. You space people out every second, third row and 6 foot. You can still get together. But even at the beginning of this, in some states, they were ready to ban drive-through worship. So, on the other side, with all religions or all organizations of faith, they by and large just said, yes, we'll do what the government wants, and religion stopped. And I've said to someone, how cheaply we are bought. People that in the past died for their faith. Well, you're not going to commit suicide for a disease that you don't have to catch, but still, why did we fade back without even a murmur?
Because it's presented in the context of for the greater good, and that's the context that often.
Code word. We could have a whole program on that.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. It gets couched in this for the greater good, and people that are not, so to speak, falling into the crevice of the greater good mentality are being labeled unjustly. I mean, I hear this term that's being used a lot nowadays, and let's just go back briefly. We're in the midst of a paradigm shift, socially, economically, politically, and the last impact is religion. We see that. We know we understand the paradigm, not just the paradigm, but the Bible scenario. So we're in this paradigm, there's a social, economic, and political paradigm that's reconstructing the way we do business, the way we do church. How is that negative when it comes to the church? You talked about that briefly. This reconstruction, so to speak.
Well, on religious liberty, we've been told, and I think you mentioned it well, you made a clear statement, your loyalty is to the Lord. We've been told that we're good citizens. Paul's very plain in his writings that we're to obey the authorities on civil matters. They're not that they do everything right, but they're standing in for God's governance in civil matters. Mm-hmm. And with our loyalty primarily to God, but unless the state asks us something contrary to our required response to God, we go along with it. Mm-hmm. That's fine, but we've long expected in different places, we've had to, even in living memory, we've had to stand up and be counted and say, just like the Hebrew worthies, we can't bow down to this image, we can't do this.
That's right.
And we've, I think, been preparing for that, but suddenly, with an emergency presented, which I think if it was not obvious early on, it should be obvious by now that it's been mismanaged. And humans mismanage everything, so that's not a direct culpability, but it's not been run well. And we're in an unusual situation where things that should have been done haven't been done. Belated, like for example, we were told officially that masks were not needed.
True.
It was nonsensical. Now we're being told to wear them. So these are not moral absolutes.
Right.
We're sort of being manipulated, hopefully for our better good in a certain sense. But I have not read anything on this, but it strikes me as odd that while it's been obvious in the modern era where we understand germs that you restrict certain liberties of someone who's infectious and may harm someone else, where there's an outbreak, you might enclose that, and some family members and so on might have to be monitored.
Quarantined, yes.
But for the first time, we are directing entire populations of healthy people, restricting their civil liberties. That without a murmur, that's happened in this country.
It's never happened.
And the world, for that matter.
But now, what do you do with the question, how do we know who's sick and how do we know who's not sick?
Right. Well, of course we don't. And I mean, it's not a hard and fast thing, but in the main, there's something that should be discussed.
Right.
We've allowed this to trump, no pun, but we've allowed this to trump all the gamut of civil liberties written down for the ages in this country in the Bill of Rights.
In the Bill of Rights.
But they don't apply in many ways, like freedom of movement. In my lifetime, we would decry in Soviet Union, for example, you needed papers to travel from one area to the other. That's come upon some people in some countries already. I was speaking to someone, I think it was in Romania, the other day, and they said can't leave their house without a written permission from the police.
It's happening in China.
Right. And admittedly, the U.S. regulations sound draconian, but they've not been enforced very hard. But I think it's softening us up to be complacent or compliant on rather extreme restrictions, in this case, on our faith.
And you know, the thing that keeps it soft in America, I believe, is the fact that we recognize a democracy, a republic that, by the people, for the people, is hard and fast sometimes as it appears to be at the top politically. Those who are leading the country still recognize that there's a grassroots that they have to rely on. It's not a dictatorship where you make a decision and everybody has to abide by it. It's still
loaded words there. Let me quote from a famous speech that, like most things, Americans justifiably think highly of their history and the grand statements. Most people can't repeat them. But Abraham Lincoln gave a wonderfully significant and wonderfully short speech at Gettysburg at the end of the Civil War.
Okay.
And among other things, it's only 1 page long.
Okay.
But among other things, he said at the end of a trial where over 1 million citizens died of a much, much smaller population, horrific. He says, we resolve that this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And then he concluded, he says, this nation shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. That's a wonderful aspiration. It's not yet lost.
No.
So this is why I think we have a right and an obligation, apart from the one as Christians, to argue for justice and godliness, but we have a right here to hold this nation to account, to ask it to live up to its promise. Police killings and beatings work against that. Even violence in a supposedly good cause
works against it.
Overzealous officials, maybe to save a few lives, but I've thought about this before. We want to save a few lives, and we've sent all the kids home. I think it's something like 40% of children in public schools depend on that free meal for survival, right?
True.
So this is not a zero-sum game. The things we've done have a huge cost, both of freedom and of lives. And almost without debate or discussion, we've entered into this enchanted ground, and you and I know that it's prophetic ground.
That's true.
Once you limit civil freedoms, religious liberty automatically is under threat. And it cannot be immaterial that at the same time we have an unprecedented alliance with a several decades long politically active Protestant and Catholic coalition of religious leaders who have been charmed by promises from this administration. And I think they're reasonable promises, but the type of promises, reasonable that they've made them to that group, but not promises for general religious liberty. The term I use, which America is right in the middle of, instead of religious liberty, we're witnessing religious entitlement for a narrow group.
You know what? That's a significant point you're making, because right now, so this takes me to the next question. What's the difference between Protestantism and evangelicalism?
Well, Protestantism, in its purest sense, describes and goes back to the original protest against the abuses of the medieval church. And, the claims of Rome, you can dispute the donation of Constantine and their legitimacy, whether they really inherited it from Peter and so on. But all of that aside, clearly, the Church of Rome was the main body, organized body of religious activity, certainly until the split with the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it embraced a lot of pagan attributes. It became very overbearing, persecutory, and so on. Well, the Protestants, Martin Luther and a few other leaders.
Zwingli, Jerome.
Yeah, there's more than Martin Luther, but quite a lot of them. Luther is pretty much the figurehead and
the axle around which.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. They doctrinally objected. They objected to the abuses of the system, and most of them thought they could reform it. It was called the Reformation.
Right.
But it was in their views of doctrinal purity and biblical authority were incompatible. So they were separated, and Rome fought them vigorously in the Counter-Reformation. And so coming all the way down to where we are now, we've inherited, particularly through English Protestantism and the society that existed at the time of the establishment of this country, we've inherited a residual Protestant viewpoint.
True.
But hardly a person in a thousand remembers the principles that made them Protestant.
True.
And in Liberty, I've trumpeted something very significant as a talisman of where we've shifted.
Okay.
Senator Santorum, a wonderful individual. He worked on legislative issues with our church. I have nothing but amazing things to say about him as a human being. He's an extremely baseline, dedicated Roman Catholic politician. He ran for president, not successfully, and he made headlines all over the US by saying, this is exactly what he said. He said, Protestantism is absent in America today. Now, absent its Protestant identity, where will we go? I know you and I share the same view that at least symbolically, the image in Revelation of this lamb-like beast that we identify with the U.S., these two horns, we can say that they're republicanism, power from the people,
and Protestantism,
defining characteristics.
Right.
And one of the characteristics is disappearing.
One of the characteristics is disappearing. That's why I asked that question, because really, when you talk about decades-old coalition between evangelicals and Catholics, evangelical and Catholic, it didn't say Protestants and Catholics, because that's the term when you go back to Ireland. The Protestants and the Catholics were always at each other's throat. Not that we justify that.
Evangelical is not an exact definition.
Right.
It's sort of a self-applied.
Like an umbrella.
There's on one rather benign level is an evangelistically inclined, outward-reaching, aggressive Protestantism. There's also more and more rolling in with it the secret rapture and dispensationalism, which. They have a right to believe that, but it's the weakest of straws from the Bible. I mean, it's a supposition at best. But so it's rolled together, and then the faction has an inordinate amount of what we would call, populist preachers who are on television. Many of them, sorry.
No, but you
know what I mean. That it's sort of it's a business of manipulating people, as most observers see. It's a strange sort of a hybrid form of religion. Well, this is all joined together. They're a coalition that share very real concerns about where the U.S. is. I really need to emphasize this. Their worry on abortion, moral decline, even concern about moral shifts that have enabled an unprecedented role for gay and lesbians and so on. Not to condemn those people, but there's no historic norm in any Christian or non-Christian country for such a shift. So they're worried about all these social and moral changes, but their solution is wrong.
Right.
Their solution is to seize the reins of power and either legislate it out of existence or compel people to behave differently.
The amazing.
That's wrong.
That is wrong. That's what we're seeing today in America. It reminds me almost of the Grecian Empire when Alexander fell and you had 4 generals trying to control this, which led to the inevitable crumble of that empire. Not that the Lord didn't predict it was going to fall, but how do you control a country when you have faction on one side, evangelicals, Catholics, Republican, then you have conservative and liberal, then you have the social unrest. You have one guy standing in the center as an axle trying to pull 5 horses together, and they're galloping as full as they can.
Well, there's many ways to come at it, but I came from Australia as a teenager, so I always look, this is the country I've lived in most of my life, but I still sort of look at it as an observer.
Okay. And
the US is a wonderful country, and we speak well of patriotism, but, in Russia, they have Mother Russia. It's a mystical bond of the people of the country that can exist whether they were under the Tsarist regime or the communists. What is it that binds people to the American dream? They talk about the American dream.
Life, for liberty, and the pursuit of happiness?
Well, that's the best. But for many people, it's a financial dream.
Right. You can become anything.
For many others, it's sort of an ascendant America, a dominant, the all-powerful. Well, that's not a very good image to carry forward. But I believe if you really analyze it, the best thing, even though it's not the governmental structure, is that there was a spiritual dream that took root here. And I can trace its antecedents to Puritanism in England. And that's sort of what's created a group consensus. But when that morphs, as it is, into religious triumphalism, you've got a dangerous move. But every country does need a unifying point.
Right.
And the US is lacking it at the moment. It's searching for it, and I'm afraid it's about to settle on a perverted version of what was always sort of ticking along beneath the superficial, beneath the surface.
Because America has offered everyone that, regardless of their belief, the freedom, and this is Liberty Magazine, the freedom to worship according to their own dictates. Whether you're Muslim, a Jew, or Hindu, or whatever you might be, you had the freedom to worship along. What do you think about when and I know Congress is not supposed to make any law respecting the establishment.
First Amendment.
We're going to talk about that.
Yeah.
But what happens when it seems as though in the clarion community or the clarion call of politics, that it seems as though when an issue arises, let's find out what the Vatican thinks about it. And on the other side, well, let's find out, are you conservative or liberal? And we have these factions. What's behind that? Well, that pull.
Touching on several things,
yeah.
And this should be mentioned along the way. The foreign policy of the U.S. at the moment, there's been articles written on this, is inordinately influenced by some insiders who have a certain prophetic view of America's role and some of the other nations, and they've rolled it in with an over-literalizing of what the Old Testament says about the status of Israel.
Okay.
They're determined to remove, for example, Iran. They see it as Magog, I think, because they're fixated on Gog and Magog. Well, they're entitled to their own interpretation, but when that morphs with U.S. policy, you've got a dangerous sort of a mix.
That's right.
Dangerous sort of a mix, and that is happening. Your question went further, though, and I'm sorry.
Right. We have Catholicism on one side.
Oh, yeah. Well, let me quote Ellen White, the Adventist visionary, who, I think there's plenty of evidence that she had insights that went a little beyond her minimal education. And she wrote this, she says, when the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such points of doctrine as are held by them in common, and we're sort of in that now.
We're right there.
She says, shall move upon the government to sustain their institutions and support their sustain and support maybe the other way around, but support their institutions and sustain their decrees. We are already big time into state aid and the promise of the pot of gold for this privileged group that have united.
Right.
Remember, we've had the faith-based initiative where welfare money was to go. We've just got an open go to acceptable churches, not necessarily offered to everyone. And she says, and then support their decrees. What are those decrees? The most important one, it's always been needed and wanted by these mainline churches, is to have religious worship mandated by law, which would be Sunday worship.
Right. And already in this COVID environment,
it's being murmured about.
It's being massaged. When you look at the impact, well, as was said, well, in India, they said for the first time we could see the Himalayas. We haven't seen it in 125 years because the smog is so minimal.
Yeah.
In Italy, where the gondolas are going forth, the motors are not running. The water is clear. They can see the fish. Yeah. In Los Angeles, they said for the first time there's no smog. It's at a minimal point. And there's a suggestion that if we were able to give the earth a single day of rest, as the Laudato Si, that document by
Laudato Si. Yeah.
Laudato Si.
Praise be to thee. It's a Latin term for praise be to thee.
is suggesting that we owe it to our planet to deliver the best version of it to the next generation. And if we could come together on one day of rest, and it's amazing to me that this is being suggested so strongly. That's one thing to suggest it, but it's another thing altogether to start to try to implement it legislatively.
I was looking at an old Liberty magazine a couple of days ago, and there was a cartoon that I'm planning on reprinting, and it had, because it was drawn a century ago, and it had a huntsman crouching next to his horse, you know, the stalking horse. People have forgotten the real role of your stalking horse. You're stalking up on the prey, hiding behind your horse. The horse is the stalking horse. And so he's coming up on the prey. He has his gun in his hand, and the horse is labeled Sunday rest, and he is labeled Sunday sacredness. and this is the same thing.
It's hiding behind the horse.
And it's not illogical. The call is, the Earth's winding down. We need to, and there's more than one document from the papacy that pushed this, the idea that we have problems with too many people, not enough jobs. So if there's one day of rest, then the work can be apportioned to more people. We've got too much pollution in that. So if your day when the factories are not running, the sky will clear. On every level, it sort of makes sense. Spiritual renewal. We know that in the U.S., the U.S. suffers from many things, but there's less vacation time in the U.S. People are more stressed than most any other country.
Right, we have less vacation.
So they need this day of rest. It all makes sense from a secular, rational level. But lurking behind this, of course, is a theological imperative.
The guy hiding behind the horse.
Yeah, force you, for your own good.
That's right.
To worship on this day.
I heard the phrase recently, and I won't say who said it, but you may have heard it. It says, this is what they want, but they don't know this is what they want.
Yeah.
I heard that said by a political leader. This is what Americans want, but they don't know this is what they want. So we have to give them what they want, but they don't know.
Well, many leaders, and even some successful leaders through the years in different countries have thought that.
Right.
I was talking to one of my guests the other day about Lee of Singapore. Mm-hmm. Very successful and rather autocratic ruler of that little nation state. That was his view,
right.
And the end result was fine, but he trod heavily on conscience in doing it. But you can't indulge that in the US. You can't have things done because this is what they should have, not what they want. If there's power deriving from the people, you better listen to the people.
That's right. Let's go back to the issue of Protestantism and Evangelicalism and Catholicism. We see that coalition coming together more overt than covert now. Here's the issue, though, and you made a point just a moment ago about the theological context. When people believe a certain way and their religious beliefs begin to dictate their legislative enactments, that's where the danger comes in. For example, our view of Israel, our view of the rapture, our view of Christ reigning on earth. This is a very overall view of evangelicalism. They're believing that, Jesus is going to come and reign on earth for 1,000 years. So it's our responsibility, get this, it is our responsibility to deliver the best earth to Jesus. So we have to clean it up environmentally, we have to clean it up morally, because when he comes, we have to deliver the earth to him in the best condition. And that's what's driving some of these agendas.
I agree with you, except that it isn't quite what you ended with.
Okay.
I don't think you've used the term yet, but dominionism
I talked about
really
it.
Custody. Dominionism is its mind to use, abuse, pillage, and to do whatever I choose with it, rather than, as the Bible explains on everything, you're a steward, you're a custodian, you're to protect it and keep it. And there's a great irony that the religious right, in their alliance with the political rightists, have been in the forefront of opening up mining and taking away ecological inhibitions. It's ironic, and they haven't yet, at the top level, linked with the Pope's initiative. There is a little disconnect between dominionism and the Pope's call to save the earth and to have the seventh day on the Sunday. Mm-hmm. But I believe events are going to bring it into synchronicity.
Because what also the push, and I was leaving the term or the word dominionism for later in the program, because that's that whole Reconstructionist ideology is something that people don't. He's kind of the other guy hiding behind the horse with Sunday worship and.
Well, bring it up later. But
I'll bring it
we
up
need to
later
talk
on.
about it because it's not at all irrelevant. I mean, it's necessary to sort of see the backstory to a lot of what's happening.
And it's important. Those who are watching the program, this information that and I hope you're following along with us because some of the terminologies we use may be brand new to you, but we're looking at it in the context of what we know as Seventh-day Adventist, as the Revelation 13 picture has presented itself. The first beast of Revelation 13 and the second beast of Revelation 13, the two horns, republicanism and Protestantism. How are these principles being used in America, or are they being abused in America? That's a very delicate razor's edge.
Give a couple of disclaimers.
Yeah.
A few years ago, and I won't name the figure, but he's one of the most well-known public figures of the religious conservative movement on television. I was sitting next to him at a banquet, and I introduced myself, and we had a wonderful talk for the whole time. But right off the bat, once I said Seventh-day Adventist, he said, "Seventh-day Adventist, you people think I'm bringing the Sunday law, don't you?" And he said, "I wrote a letter to your headquarters explaining that I'm not." And I said, "Well, no, I don't think you're trying to bring the Sunday law, but I said a lot of what you're involved with has that as its natural consequence."
That's right.
And I've met with many of the so-called religious right over the years, particularly in my previous job where I was working with a drug education journal that we were dealing with religious and political groups. And I admire many of those people greatly. When we'd meet together, they practically always would pray fervently that the Lord would heal this country.
Right.
I don't believe that's a cynical prayer. They are burdened by the spiritual state of this nation. But there's another side of it that scared me, and it's getting worse. They've got to be in their bonnet that the Constitution is being misunderstood, and in particular, the First Amendment does not require or have anything to do with separation of church and state. They are adamantly opposed to the separation of church and state. They say it's not in the Constitution, it's not biblical, it's not constitutional, it's a wrong concept. And this is many years ago, but it's a powerful statement. Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade, in his last days when he was on oxygen, I saw him on television, and he looked into the camera and he says, "The separation of church and state is a satanic concept." So their opposition to the separation of church and state and religious liberty under the individual conscience, they're more and more adamantly opposed to that. And when you oppose conscience, you're on a wrong cause.
We're going to talk about that in our second hour. That's very important because where we're headed right now as a country, many of the citizens, let me put it this way, when your life focuses life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, if all I have to do is keep you happy, I could take anything out of your backyard, and as long as you're locked to your video game entertainment or whatever you want is at your disposal, as long as I can keep you happy, if that's my focus, I just want to make you happy, then you give me the liberty to take away anything, and you'll say, sure, just don't take away my video console, because that's my happiness, or the malls, and this is something that's amazing to me. The outcry during this COVID had not been so much. Later on it became that, but the outcry had been, we can't go to the mall anymore, we can't go to the baseball anymore, we can't go to the movie theater anymore. Yeah. The outcry, and people on Facebook have even said, I can't wait till the mall opens up again. I can't wait till the movie theater opens up again. I can't wait till all my pleasurable things open up again, rather than saying, I can't wait till I can worship according to my own dictates. Because that's being eroded gradually, and we're going to talk about that in the second hour of our program.
Well, what it's revealed is perhaps a rather shallow aspect to the culture that's developed in this consumerist society. And that removed from our playthings, we really don't have a philosophical, ideological, or theological base to our activities and thinking. So it is a bit of a moment of truth, I think, for the US and Western civilization as a whole. And it is a turning point, and all turning points are, as the Orientals say, a dangerous opportunity. And it could go in a desperate direction, as Weimar Germany did between the wars. It ended up with National Socialism. Or you could move toward a more enlightened, democratic, power from the people type thinking. I don't know. Or it could go to the French Revolution.
True. And
I always take seriously what Ella White, writing to Seventh-day Adventists in the early days of Adventism, she said that the scenes throughout the whole world at the end of time will be like those of the French Revolution.
And it's happening. I mean, we could see it. What's amazing about it, though, is because there's so much happening right now, we're living in a highly distracted environment. So, you ask yourself the question, which one of these distractions is becoming more important to me? And that's why, as a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, and you know this, and those of you who are watching the program that are Seventh-day Adventists, you have to maintain a clarity as to where you're headed. You made a point just a moment ago, and we'll talk about this as we unwrap it in the second hour of the program. The person that said, well, you're accusing us of bringing in the Sunday law. Well, what we're saying is if you keep driving west and you began in Florida, you're going to get to California whether you believe it, whether you say you're going to California or not. If you keep driving west, we know where this is headed. And the Lord has given us this beautiful picture that we have to not only adore, but we have to protect. As a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, it is important that my theology, my way of life, my sermons, even my approach to social and political and economic and religious issues all maintain the context of what the Bible has told me, or we become like the disciples in the days of Jesus. And Jesus made a statement that I want to kind of lead out of this first hour. One of the reasons why, as Christians, we should not be fighting in and of ourselves over political issues. We should not allow political issues to create division in our churches, whether you're conservative or liberal, which are terms that don't appear in the Bible. We should not allow these kinds of issues to cause us to be at one another's throats, because Jesus said this statement, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my disciples would fight." And so 20 seconds, what could we look forward to in the second hour? We're going to talk about dominionism, the Johnson Amendment.
You should, yeah. But I'm glad you got on to Jesus' statement about the two kingdoms. A.T. Jones, the longtime religious liberty editor of our church, he wrote a book, I think it was called The Two Kingdoms.
That's right.
And we're a little bit like Shakespeare had a comment about men, actually, but he says, one foot on land and 1 foot on sea.
That's right. And we're going to find out what that is in our second hour. So don't go away. We're just getting started on religious liberty. What does it mean to America and the world at large? As you know, when America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. Don't go away. We have some interesting topics for the second hour. We're just getting started. We believe that this is the time you must continue to stay tuned. See you in just a moment. Welcome back to the second hour of this Preparation for Independence Day program. As you know, liberty and liberty inside it and religious liberty is something that we treasure very much here in America, and you should too, but so many of our audience members really don't think about liberty on a day-by-day basis. We kind of go to work, go to church, if we can do that, and participate in life in the altered way that COVID-19 has brought it to our platform. However, when we don't think of how important liberty is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, life and happiness has cradled liberty in the center. This is something that's so significant, and every one of us, on one way, either socially, economically, politically, or religiously, are going to be impacted by the topic of liberty. Once again, if you're just joining us, I have Lincoln Steed. Good to have you here, Lincoln.
Always good.
Your mom must have known Abraham Lincoln somewhere along, or heard about him, because what a name you have to be involved in this kind of environment.
Can I dispel that? I was named after a silver spoon they had that was a Lincoln brand, and they liked the way it was written.
Okay.
But Lincoln is a very, there's Lincolnshire, the town of Lincoln in England, and Lincoln Green for Robin Hood.
So you do have some...
But that said, I've always admired U.S. history and the best things of the United States. And, the best in the U.S. is the best in the world. It doesn't mean it's a perfect country or the only free country, but the aspirations of the U.S. are inspiring.
Wow. Well, before we dive into the second hour, we always like good music. And right now, Yvonne Shelton is going to sing this wonderful song called America. And what an appropriate song for this time of year. As you hear the song, as you listen to the lyrics, think about the role that you can play as an American citizen to reflect the character and the place that Jesus Christ would have us to stand.
United under God and flag, we are one. We stand for right, and we will fight to protect this land of ours, America.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America.
United under God and flag, we are one. We stand for right, and we will fight to protect this land of ours, America.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Please join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
To
That's a 4th of July song. Thank you so much, Yvonne. America, we are one. Now, that is a prayer that we're praying because right now, that's what we need in America. We are one. And how is that going to be accomplished? Whose oneness agenda are we going to follow? We'll talk about that briefly. And as a Christian, as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, we know that the agenda of the Bible, the agenda of Jesus and the understanding of Bible prophecy should serve to keep us in the connection as being one. But Lincoln, you know that America we have a checkered history, but we have a valid beginning. Let's talk about that briefly. Why did the Lord raise up America?
Well, that's terminology. I wouldn't directly say the Lord raised it up, but the Lord used the formation of this new land,
right,
separate from the old world, to be a shelter for many dissidents of different types. Some of them were just freebooters, political dissidents, but there was a pattern of people in the post-Reformation era where there were still persecutions. There was a pattern of different dissidents, usually Protestants, but even some Catholic groups that came across to get away from the persecutions of the old world. So it became a shelter, and it was more of a blank sheet, not demographically, the Indians.
Right, the Indians were here.
But it was a blank sheet, there was no overall government. They had to form as an ancillary at first to the British system, but eventually it became a uniquely American way of looking at the future of mankind. It's a very aspirational country and constitution. It's not by accident that it talks about a new world order.
Matter of fact, I want to just share this, the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, and this is what Danny just said that, but I think that in the context of the music, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, provide the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's the ideal. That's the ideal. How are we doing? Give us a report card.
Well, we're not doing nearly as good as we would like, but that's the human condition.
Right.
We damned correctly communism for not living up to its ideal.
Right.
If you read the Communist manifestos, and I'm hardly a communist,
right.
But there's some fine aspirations. The brotherhood of mankind and so on. It fell down on human greed and the dictatorship of the people and so on. It just collapsed. But similarly, our fine experiment has fallen on the rocks now and then because of, if you study U.S. history, big business, robber barons and so on, because of rapacious attitudes out west and, the bloodthirst to get the land regardless of the Indians and so on. There's a lot of down things on the U.S., but what's redeemed it to this point is these enduring words that were well thought out. They were not perfect men, but they'd seen the problems with the old world. They were severing their ties with England and the claims of the monarchy. And I have a great burden of history. You can't understand it unless you know the English Civil War, the Puritan role in it, John Milton's. He wrote many books, but he wrote one book on the tenure of kings and magistrates, explaining why they killed the king. Jefferson quotes directly from it in the Declaration of Independence, which put a theological cast to it, because in England they had rejected the king who claimed that he was ordained by God. They were challenging God himself to put the king down. So it was necessary in the Declaration of Independence to invoke a higher power in their separation. And that's fine, because I do think God wants us to be, not to be ruled by other men. As Senator Ashcroft, once Attorney General, used to sing, there's no king but Jesus.
That's right.
America can embrace that. We didn't put George Washington in as king. The power resided with the people, but the people's power came from a creator God. That's very plainly enunciated. So that's a high aspiration, falls down over and over again, but as of this point, we have not repudiated
No.
a word that Ellen White uses, but not
principles of our
repudiated
Constitution.
these principles yet.
That's right.
Probably never burn the document, but we may, I hope not soon, come to a point where we go another direction and just sort of wave a censor over that and say holy words, but this is what we do now.
Because you know that in the context of, I don't want to think of this as being near in our near future, but when martial law is instituted, when any kind of domestic control is instituted, well, I can't yell, well, this is my right or that's my right.
You put your finger on it. Martial law is not so much that the military's around and it's a dangerous time, but constitutional guarantees disappear.
It disappears.
You have those rights and are gone. And to some degree, that's always implicit in Western law. I've really been bothered over the years as we've pushed different religious legislation to protect our rights, like the Workplace Religious Freedom Restoration Act was a good one. But like all that legislation at the end, it has, this is your right and the law and so on, unless there's a compelling governmental interest. When there's a pressure, all the chips are in, the government will say, well, we have to do this and go on. But that should be kept till the very end, and we shouldn't acknowledge that resides there, but be aware.
Right, it shouldn't be the first, it shouldn't be the first, it should be the last on the possible options to lean on.
But by appealing to a higher power, the amendments, which are add-ons to the Constitution and a condition of its passage, they're not immaterial, I mean, they're central, but they are amendments. Those things are important, not because the government gave them, it recognized them.
Kennedy said that. He made a statement, and people were very concerned when John F. Kennedy was becoming president because of his Catholic.
I was just old enough to remember the panic, even at the distant shore in Australia. I think I was about 12 at the time.
I want to just say for the record, I was very, very young. I wasn't even double digits yet. But I remember, I have a great sense of memory. I didn't remember the speech then, but I went back because my mom bought the 33 LP of all of John Kennedy's speeches, and I still have it to this very day when he has that very studious picture that looks very presidential, very solemn and humble on the cover. And I was listening, and he said, how freedom is not something that is offered by the state, but it's our right given to us by God. Right. And he said, I vow not to allow my religious convictions to interfere with my political
I think he said,
aspirations.
and I will not allow a priest or prelate to tell me what to do.
And exactly.
And I must tell you, a little ominously, without naming names because I don't remember that, but there was a statement from the US Catholic bishops a couple of election cycles ago that they said they'd made a mistake with Kennedy and not holding him to account on that, and they would not make that mistake again.
Right. And and let's go ahead and point this out, we all know when we look at the biblical scenario, that's the thing that really makes liberty important. Now, let me put this way. We may stop at many restaurants on our way to our destination by car, but we never forget our destination. And as Seventh-day Adventists, we understand the biblical narrative as best as God described it to us, and praise the Lord for Ellen White's inspiration and understanding for Behind the Curtain. But if we forget that, we can be distracted. Let's talk about some of those distractions that could somehow sidetrack the purpose for the church. Because right now we're living in the COVID-19 environment, whether to wear a mask or not to wear a mask, and then we have the political unrest on the other side, and the social injustices, and pull down the statues or leave them up, or change all the laws or leave them in place. There's a very hot stove sensitivity today. And what's the danger for the church in getting involved in a lot of these issues?
As you asked the question, you know what was said to early Adventists in regard to this type of thing, that we need to keep our eyes fixed as Seventh-day Adventists, a movement brought into being prophetically to proclaim the nearness of Christ's return, but more importantly, to prepare ourselves and others. That's the solidarity, that's the group think on this. It's not just for us to get there, it's to bring as many others, it's to share the good news. Ellen White warned on this, and she says that, that we really cannot forget present truth. That was the term she used.
That's right.
Things that relate to what we're called to proclaim. Now, as Christians, if you have I think the Bible says, have the bowels of Christ in you. In other words, a deep-seated sentiment as Christ had, where he wept over Jerusalem and helped we have to be responsive to the poor, to the maligned. And we're not pushing a gay agenda, but it shouldn't it should trouble us deeply to see, as a few years ago now, Matthew Shepard strung up on a wire fence there in Colorado.
Right.
I mean, that's an inhuman act. We should argue for the protection of people, regardless of what they're doing.
That's right.
It's a spiritual matter to bear with them, to change their lives, and anyone that's doing something that's outside of biblical norm, but you can't force them. But we should defend them. We should defend even the criminal. You know, these police killings can easily morph into, you know, bad cops, good person.
Right.
It's a bit vague.
Right.
You know, there's criminality that the police as law agents are responding to, but are they allowed, are they called to use deadly force at the drop of a hat? Of course no.
No.
So we need to
balance it, or try to
I think
balance.
speak and defend the powerless. The Bible says that the
right.
widows and the orphans.
That's right.
Of course we should be sensible to
Do
those
justice,
things.
yeah.
But as a movement, we can't major in that as Jesus didn't major in the abuses of the Roman occupation.
No.
It was horrific. If you know anything about how Rome kept law and order, yes, they had Pax Romana. Peace was a peace of the dead a lot of the times, and inflexible laws, and you know they would make things work. The roads went down at the freeways were
all
branching out over the.
That's right.
But it was an unjust system. Jesus said very little other than Herod's a fox. He was aware of the situation, but he was for the kingdom. And present truth means that Seventh-day Adventists and all other Christians that will pick up this movement, because we're a movement, not a structure.
Right.
The structure is to protect this movement now in a time of relative peace. But we should be focused on the kingdom, present truth. That's the message of the moment.
Right. If we lose our focus and put all of our finances and energies into areas that are not unjust, these are just issues that need to be addressed, but we should not allow it to be the major
proof of the
focus.
pudding for, you're right, for the proof of the pudding for Adventists, if you examine our history, the Adventist Church as an organization was formed exactly at the time of the Civil War. And Ellen White, writing to this relatively small membership there, she was unequivocal. She said that God's punishment is resting on the South for its embrace of slavery.
That's right.
She made it a direct moral issue. But as they formed up, that's exactly when they decided they would be non-combatants, because they were not called to fight that war.
Right.
They could decry that injustice, but they were on the kingdom road. And present truth demanded a major focus about Christ's return and preparing for that.
That's right. And while we address issues that are unjust on the racial sense, the social sense, these issues that are bringing inequality, we should be supportive of equality.
We're not called to be silent. I think
exactly.
we should be touched, but as it says, touched by a feeling of
our
the infirmity.
And Jesus, as he did in the story of the Good Samaritan, we cannot be the religious leader on our way to church that sees the injustices and cross the street. We cannot be the Levite, the priest that sees the injustice. We have to be the Samaritan that says, okay, what can we do to relieve the suffering and do our part? But then we have to, as he did, notice it's a part of the story that we often forget. He said, okay, I'm going to pay whatever his bill is required, but I'm going to leave him here. You take care of him. And we don't know what the Samaritan did after he left, but he didn't stay at the hotel with the guy. So I'm making this point here. We don't stay at the hotel.
We don't even know if it really happened. It's an
allegorical parable. Yeah. But the whole point of it brings out this idea that...
But there's any number of possibilities, but it's a wonderfully engaging model of how we should treat other people, of course.
And Jesus speaking to the religious. So in other words, as you are religious, don't ignore these. Take care of the widow, the fatherless. Deal with the issues that are unjust, but don't allow that, because here's the challenge. We could become a distraction and almost create a wall between other people even listening to us by blanketing.
And we also can inadvertently stumble into partisan political action.
Right.
And the warning was early on given to Seventh-day Adventists to avoid partisan political activity.
That's right.
But that's the key word, partisan. I've said it on this program before. I listen to stuff out of Washington. All the time I hear a politician saying on some issue, oh, I'm not being political on this. Well, he can't help being. It's a political issue. What he means is I'm not being partisan.
That's right.
And the church and church members at least acting for the church, the body of believers, you can't afford to be partisan. If nothing else, I've seen it in some countries, you tilt toward one party or one regime, then they leave and the others treat you as the enemy. You've unduly polarized the situation for yourself.
That's why it's important, and I want to bring this out right now to Christians in general, but specifically to Seventh-day Adventist Christians. It's very important that as church members, we come to church on Sabbath or even whatever day during the week when we meet on Wednesday nights or we have social gatherings, that we do not take that opportunity to decry and to push any particular political opponent or proponent, because, as you just made a point, very significant, when the person we favor leaves office, what other bandwagon are we going to get on now, and how relevant are we going to be seen by the people that we ostracized when
I won't
our
give any
favorite
facts.
political
Right
leaders
now
in office?
in a country in Africa, our church has a huge problem.
Right.
Because there's a leadership challenge. One group of leadership belong to one tribe and one are in with the government, and they're enemies from another tribe, and they're using all of the power of the government against the church, but it's really for a factional personal interest, nothing to do with theology. But you can destroy and hamstring permanently a church operation with this partisan thinking.
You can. Let's talk about the Johnson Amendment. This is something that's come up.
Very relevant. With COVID, we've heard little about it, but it's still percolating on. Early on in his administration, the president, anxious to please and placate his religious right base, assured everyone that they would work immediately for the repeal of the Johnson Amendment. And I think outside religious liberty circles, not many people are aware of it, but it dates back to Lyndon Johnson's time in Congress, and he had a difficult re-election campaign at one point, and a number of groups, including some church groups, opposed him. And like a lot of political leaders, he kept the list of enemies. So after the battle was over, he decided and followed through on putting an amendment on a bill, which is how a lot of stuff gets through. You tack it on almost in the middle of the night. And the Johnson Amendment got through, which forbids churches and other non-profits and so on from engaging in overt political activity, which is consistent with the Constitution anyway, but it spelled it out very plain. And there's a catch-22 on this, because as we've said before, the churches, by the separation of church and state, the First Amendment, shouldn't be involved in political activity.
That's right.
It's really wrong anyway. But it's also not great to have the government mandating church activity, restricting them consciously. So this administration are determined to undo it, and undoing it this way will mean that they are giving a green light, in fact, overt encouragement in the most blatant form for the churches to become political action groups.
That's the sad part of it.
Unambiguous, to bring in candidates into the church, to promote their agenda from the pulpit, for the church to raise money for that party or that candidate. Now, they've tried this before. Some years ago, there was a move pushed by D. James Kennedy and a few others
James Kennedy.
For the Jones Bill, they called it. And their view was unbind the churches. They felt the churches were being bound by not being able to enter the political fray. You know, and the irony was that in the interim, there was the, I'm forgetting the sponsors, but there was the Campaign Reform Act that limited the ability to give money to political parties. And that's been short-circuited now with these PACs, political action groups, where they can get unlimited money. But the Jones Bill failed, and now this is the end run with the repudiation of the Johnson Amendment. But amazingly, with this open intention, and the president, you got to give him his dues, he gets one way or another what he wants by and large, but somehow he hasn't pushed this through. A year or two ago, it was put on a bill where it would have repudiated, and they never made an announcement, but I listened late the night before. There was a little announcement that had been pulled. I don't know why, but they pulled it at the last minute. So it is, as far as I know, it still hasn't actually been formally repudiated. But probably the intention is more important than whether or not it gets through. It's
the intention.
It shows what's really going on. There's a hungering for political power and also the government money. which will come with it.
Which goes back to the phrase, as a man thinketh, so is he.
Right.
I may not follow through on the act, but this is what I really want to do.
Yeah.
And I'm going to push the edge of that envelope. I'm not saying that I'm doing this because I repealed the amendment, but my activities are saying I stand firmly against it.
Yeah.
You know, I travel quite a bit on the road, and I was in different churches, so many different denominations when I was with the Heritage Singers, and the travel was still something that we've done. But usually whenever a church leader, and this is something that I can't do even as a pastor, I can't tell my church members as citizens of America, this is what you need to vote for, this is who you need to vote for, this is why you need to vote. When I do that, I am literally infringing on their religious.
Right.
I can't say not to vote, or don't support or to support. But
and you're breaking your trust.
I'm breaking my trust.
You know, the church is given certain, got to be careful, I would say, concessions from the state because of its independent status, its higher role. But if you use that to pursue a political agenda, you're thoroughly compromising the church leadership role.
That's why the First Amendment, and I'll read this briefly here, somebody inevitably watching the program might say, I don't even know what the First Amendment is. Well, here it is. Yeah. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press.
I was going to say, read the second half.
You know, this is amazing. We're seeing these things chisel away.
Right now, anyone knows that that's being trodden on.
It's not even being chiseled away. It's being sledgehammered away.
Yeah.
The freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
You've gotten on to how we responded to COVID and the demonstrations. They're all rolled
It's all right here. The First Amendment, not the 15th. This is not way down there tucked away in the back drawer. Let's start with the amendments. This is the first
and I'll
one.
repeat, if people don't know the history, these amendments were a condition of most of the states, or the 13 colonies that gathered together. They made it a condition of signing the Constitution that these be added.
Right, every one of the
states. They weren't immaterial. These were central to the whole affair.
That's why it's number one. You know, we always say keep the main thing the main thing. When the main thing is in place, then the other things don't fall out of line. It's like saying, well, it's a beautiful car, but it has no engine in it. This is the engine of the way that our society should be framed. So watch this. Congress, let's break it down. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment.
The word there is no law.
Thank you. No law. Yeah. Okay, talk about that, because you're in that.
Well, it's to be hands off. They're not in the religious business.
Right.
The best you can come up with, as the religious right do, as that was passed by the Congress, individual states still were doing the contrary. They had established churches and so on. But it soon sorted itself out, and after the Civil War, irrevocably so. Mm-hmm. So this is the default setting for the Republic.
Right, so what if
no law on religion.
So I can't say Congress favors Evangelicalism. I can't say it favors the Baptists or Seventh-day Adventists or Catholicism. Congress can't make any law in favor or prohibiting any of them.
Because it's challenged, as I said, by some of the religious activists. The backup is the other religion clause, and I should remember the article number, but it says there shall be no religious test for public office. So religion's off the table.
Right. But we have seen, I think maybe over the last, I would say, in my recollection, Jimmy Carter on forward. Because Jimmy Carter, he was hailed for his Christian stance. But then it really became prominent when Reagan came into office. It was very much prominent, but we know back then that was when the religious right and the moral majority were very, hands-on in America. And it took a number of presidents to get to where we are today. But the other thing about is prohibiting.
Where are we today? Tell me where we.
Well, the whole thing about prohibiting the free exercise.
How would you characterize it?
Well, since I'm a guest on the program.
I had a guest the other day that did it with me. He was asking me.
Let me give you.
I was on a TV program once, and I asked one of the other guests a question, and the compere said, "I'm the one that asked the question."
Okay, well,
but I'm really.
Okay, but watch this.
You're right. Someone asked me, "What's the king? Who's the king of the north?" And I said, "I'm not going to answer that. You say."
Right. So here's the point. I should not, as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, say to a Muslim, "You don't have the right to practice your religion in America." I shouldn't say to the Buddhist, "I don't agree with you, and I'm going to do everything I can to prevent you from practicing your religion." I can't do that, and I cannot appeal to the Congress to say, "I don't like what he believes, so stop him from teaching that."
But the unspoken agenda at the moment is that after 9/11 particularly, America has developed an aversion to Islam and all that it represents. It's not particularly religious, but they've got this vague inkling that it's a threatening religion.
Extreme.
So that, I believe, is given impetus to this exclusive empowerment of a certain part of Christianity, not even all Christianity.
Right. And then now, what about freedom of, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press?
And we're well along on that. I'm telling you, back in the Bush administration, people have forgotten, I think, already, because we're a news cycle people, and whatever we see on TV, and then it's gone. But when President Bush was inaugurated, remember, it was in the context of a very disputed election.
Right.
And he wanted to do the walk along Pennsylvania Avenue, and they started throwing things on him. So he got in the car and sped to the White House. It was a very nasty situation.
The hanging Chad.
And I can't endorse it. It was horrible. He was the leader, and he needed respect. But as a consequence of that, progressively they restricted speech, and it came to the point where you were not allowed to demonstrate anywhere near the president. They would rope off an area a mile or two away sometimes from where the president was, and they would call it the free speech zone.
Or the freedom from speech zone.
Well, that's what it was, but the free speech zone. I mean, a perversion of language, and that's where you could say whatever you want and howl against the government policy.
Outside of that.
But not near. Well, so we were already crossed a few barriers in nullifying that right.
I call it erosion. Things don't, rocks don't fall off of mountains because it just all of a sudden became loose.
I mean, he was a problem on the Supreme Court, but Scalia, who's dead now, I heard him speak a few times, and he spoke truth now and then, and he said that he had voted for the right of the individual to burn the flag. And I don't think the Supreme Court would pass such a thing now.
No.
But he made that comment that just because you find it distasteful doesn't mean you should restrict it. That's really the proof of free speech particularly. You have to allow people to say something that you find grossly objectionable. That's when the free speech is proven, not when they're murmuring on irrelevancies and, let them say that. No, it's when it's in your face and you hate it. But we're already to the point where that's not acceptable. And this, I think in the pre-discussions, we were talking about how sometimes of late, that sort of speech will quickly get the idea that, at least they did, you're not an American, you're an enemy.
Right.
That sort of language ends badly, in my view. A few years ago, I wrote an editorial where I put a turn of phrase in I still like, and I had even Michael Moore, the filmmaker, email me, and he says, "I think you went a little bit too far on that," but I stick with it. I said the difference between the hate talk on often right-wing radio in the US and the hate talk on the radio in Rwanda that preceded the killing is one of degree, not of kind. Because I hear it's usually right-wing, but I can't say that it's one or the other. But they'll portray their political enemies as non-Americans, as enemies of the country, as sympathizers with whoever enemy we've got. Right. And I might understand that it's rhetoric, but there's an element of any country that they take that to heart. Oh, enemies. And we had it we're talking about the origins of this country. Something that's not known very well. Benjamin Franklin, one of the icons. Okay. He had his home burned down because the mob believed he was against the American Revolution.
But
and he escaped with his life. But later he was rehabilitated. That's not a good thing to be cast as an enemy of the wonderful ideals that should characterize the United States.
America is not a nationality, a particular ethnic group. America is a melting pot.
It should be a dream.
It should, not a nightmare, unfortunately. Right. And we're living in a very volatile social climate that has the reconstruction of the social, economic, political, and eventually everything that comes before religion definitely affects religion. So that's where we're headed.
When I was growing up as a Seventh Adventist, I'm a fourth generation, and studying the prophecies we're talking about, or having them given to me and I was studying, I remember a lot of talk, at times almost paranoid, about watch out when the United States has constitutional conventions and rethinks the Constitution. That's when a Sunday law.
I heard that, yeah.
I don't really believe that anymore. We don't need a change in the Constitution to bring about such a thing.
Because the word is repudiate.
But I have never before read and heard as much active discussion and banding about of the need for a new Constitution. There are many top magazines and fora in the United States now that are actively discussing maybe we need to redo the document. And so the danger there is not so much narrowly Sunday law. I think the danger is just the whole experiment going off the rails.
It is, because you're not talking about just a day of worship. You're talking about the framework of a society.
Like, think about what's our society. I mean, I'm generalizing. There's wonderful people, wonderfully balanced, knowledgeable people.
Everybody wants.
But in the main, we're a society that are bred on television, sitcoms, TV games.
Right.
Almost an alternate reality. Gross ignorance on history. Gross ignorance on all the I doubt it's so now, but in the past, only I think it was 6% could name the sitting president. So it's not a greatly informed populace, and you only have to read the founding fathers at some length to know that they believed an educated, moral community were the only ones that were safe to entrust this experiment to. So if we were to come up with a new constitution, what would they come up with? This is the Hunger Games mentality.
Oh, man.
The latest film, which is ominous to the extreme, which is widely circulated, is the what is it called? Anyhow, the idea.
It'll come to you in a moment.
It's a film that once a year, there's a period of time. I think it's one day where you get to kill whoever you want, take care of business. It's not illegal to kill someone.
Yeah, I saw the commercial for that. It's kind of like a Purge.
The Purge.
The Purge, yeah. The Purge, yeah.
Now, I don't believe that just because there's a film it's going to happen. But at the best of times, Jules Verne and other science fiction writers have incorporated what they see as developing trends. They've written it down, and then in a feedback loop, it sort of feeds the development, right? It's long since in our rearview mirror that the book 1984, written in 1948, which spoke of a dystopian Big Brother future, we've moved past that. It was very insightful. So I don't dismiss Hunger Games and The Purge. I think that those
massaging of the mindset.
They're reading sort of a debauched process come from all these horror movies and so on. It appeals to people more than before.
You know, the strange thing about that, if somebody and we have this irrational mindset that's accompanying a lot of the political dogma that's infiltrating the church. That's why I need to make this point very clearly for those watching and listening to the program. It is very relatively important for a Christian to maintain connection with the Bible.
Absolutely.
Because the only book that can maintain sanity about how a person's life should be, for example, love your neighbor as yourself. You don't hear that being espoused today. If we had people that are quote-unquote religious in their framework of their politics say, you know what, we may not agree with our neighbor, but love your neighbor as yourself. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, by your love for one another. If we begin to espouse these principles, then people will begin to say, you're right, I cannot treat my brother or my neighbor that way, regardless of his convictions religiously, his race, his ethnic background, his country of origin, or his financial status. These are the principles of Christianity that makes liberty of significant importance.
Absolutely.
It's the foundation of it.
And I tried to incorporate that earlier. What we're aiming at is not to get ourselves to heaven.
Right.
It's to, in going to heaven, take other people with us.
Take other people with us.
And the Bible's plain. It's loving your neighbor as yourself.
And if we ostracize people because we disagree with the ideology, I have good friends that don't agree with me politically, that don't agree with me doctrinally, but we meet every week.
Yeah.
And we talk together, we pray together, we read the Bible together. And in this way, I'm able to, and they are able to express in their own lives. I say, okay, you pray today. Well, you pray today. And my good friends don't believe what I believe and don't necessarily stand on the same political platform. But we say, this was a really moving statement that the good friend of mine, Senator, he's a Republican senator, he said, you know, it feels so good to have a person like you in my corner that I could turn to and have pray with me. This is the ideal of America. We should disagree on things that don't make us disagreeable, but we should maintain a condition of Christianity in that.
Something that we've already touched on that's worth restating. I believe it's long been true, but now it's almost overwhelmingly true, that as Christians, perhaps closer to the time of trouble than before and with the kingdom beyond, we need to have our minds fixed, knowledgeable about God, emotionally connected to God, and aware that reality is not always clear. This disinformation ad nauseum floating around us. It's not just lying. There's another reality being pushed on people on YouTube and the other things. You can even see a video. It can be manufactured almost from nothing.
I can make you say what you didn't say.
Right. And I believe sooner rather than later, we're even going to see things. Like, for example, this is a rough version of what's coming, but there have been youth concerts where Michael Jackson, dead, has danced on stage.
Yeah.
And from a distance, they can't tell because it's a projection.
Hologram.
But I believe those things are increasing so rapidly, they'll be believable unless you come literally to touch it. And so the deceptions are on every hand, and then as well as that, group psychology is being practiced. And I hate to say it, but I'm not making this up. I've read a number of times that some public figures, not just at the moment, in the last couple of decades, they're studying the writings of some of the master manipulators of the 20th century. You know, Goering is quoted quite a lot about how you can deceive the masses and so on. So there's manipulation where you create an emergency, disorient people, then throw in something they would otherwise reject.
Right, it's called the Hegelian dialect,
Yes,
which you...
I didn't want to use the term. That
Okay. George Hegel. That's I've told people about that before. It's the ability to create three options. You have the thesis, you have the antithesis, and then you have the synthesis. Try to say those words 10 times. So here's my particular view, my thesis. Here's my antithesis opposed to my thesis. And here's my synthesis. I have your vote and I got your vote. And we are, I mean, honestly, if we think that any politician sits in that powerful a seat and doesn't use some form of manipulation, that's why it's important, and I want to reiterate this, it's important for Christians to hold the Bible as the higher book of esteem above any political agenda. Right. Not that we should be silent about issues that we don't support.
And we can pray, in fact, not can, should pray for all the leaders. We should be always morally and spiritually supportive of their potential to help the situation.
And now we have, let's talk about briefly dominionism. We talked about that briefly because this is something that's
it's an interesting, I mean, if people think that the rise of Islamic fundamentalism, because of the stresses of modernization in the Middle East, is unique to that area, they've missed something, because we've seen the same thing in the US. You know, modernization is advancing as quickly here as anywhere. And so back, I'm not sure if it was the 60s or 70s.
In the 60s, yeah.
Yeah, Rushduni came up, and of course he was not in a vacuum. That was also the period of Francis Schaeffer and the Labrie retreat and the big formation of activism against abortion and so on. But Rushduni developed a whimsical idea, but turned it toxic, that maybe in this land of promise, and this is the toxic thing in America, an exceptional America that's sort of not bound by the norms because it's God's own country, that here, to really live up to the promise, we need to establish in this country an Old Testament economy, regulated and ruled by the norms and instructions given under a theocracy in the Old Testament. But he never made it clear who would speak for God. But, you know, it's laid out, very rigorous. For example, there would be a little transition period, I think it was 6 months. But after that, there would be mandatory death for immoral behavior like adultery. a mandatory death for homosexuality, and ominously for Adventists, mandatory death for Sabbath breaking, in other words, not keeping Sunday worship. And at first, when a few non-believers or cynics read that, they thought, sort of crazy. But he's plugged away and linked into this developing political stream of at first Protestantism and then a linkage with elements of Catholicism. And I've noticed over the years, his brother and his son-in-law, rather, Gary North, who's carried on the movement, he's very often with the groups that meet with the different presidents in Washington.
That's
so
right.
He has a voice, as some of our own people say. He has a seat at the table. And it's developed that dominionism, it's a pretty rigorous, far-out thing for most people, but it's morphed into, not dominionism, Christian Reconstructionism, it's morphed into dominionism, which is sort of a light version.
That's right.
But it's a heavy application, as we said earlier, of what is in the Bible, that God gave Adam custody of the animals. He was to name them. He was to till the garden. He was the one who was given the trust of this new creation.
That's right.
But dominionism takes it to a more authoritarian level, where it's the direct ownership of the faithful, and it just hit me. In some ways, it's sort of like John Calvin's privileged chosen. But these people then have the right to order the resources. God gave it to them. They will decide, what's mine and what's done here. They're not so much caring for it as the one that farms it out. So it's the control of this country by the elect Protestant few.
And this ideology, now a lot of times there may be those watching the program that said, I've never heard that term before, dominionism.
Well, it actually pops up a lot in Christianity Today, for example, just any magazine like that.
So when you hear a religious leader say, it is our right to control the government, the church should be the voice of America, that is the aftermath. That is the clarion call of dominionism.
Yeah.
And dominionists believe, it would be good to just do your homework. Dominionists believe that the only reason for the existence of the Constitution is to give the church complete control of the state. And that's an ideology that if you look at history, and you know and I know, and if you've been watching, when the church was in charge of the state, take me back to the Dark Ages. That's just
where it
sample.
falls down, the theocracy wasn't a democratic system.
No.
God ruled directly in the sense that he spoke transparently through Moses at first,
right,
and then prophetic leaders, and it was clear. But under a modern day dominionism, I have to take on faith that leader now speaks for God, that they have any connection at all. No. In fact, the chances are overwhelming that it's someone in their private view of religion, and human nature being what it is, it morphs instantly toward a religious dictatorship.
That's right. So Revelation 13, astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson said, and this is a term when I heard this, I couldn't let it get by. He says, one of the dangers we face is to know enough about a subject to think we're right, but not enough of that subject to know we're wrong. I thought that was an amazing topic, because you have a lot of people that are in that paradigm of religious thinking, and they say, well, this is what's best for you as a citizen. Where do you see this all headed? In the context of Revelation 13, we know where the Bible told us, but where do you see this great country headed?
Well, there's so many angles, but I do believe there's going to be a religious revival, but of a mixed type. COVID yet, it's amazing. I haven't heard much of a call by any group to sort of prayer and fasting and repentance as a nation and a move toward godliness. But this type of thing, in the degree that the Middle Ages saw it, where a sizable percentage of the population is at risk of imminent death, leads to huge introspection, huge fanatical religious activity, and many people going back to basics and seeking the Lord. So I think when that develops, we will see people rediscovering their true faith in God, others being pulled toward recognizing that God alone can save them, and then also those who have a religious agenda but not a true faith, trying to seize control and push their faith in others. So it's a great dividing time, which of course the Bible speaks about. But I think it's sociologically inevitable. As I say, in the Islamic world, that's what's happening.
True.
Islam has been reasserted in a way. Remember, Islam has been a lot like Catholicism. They're born a Muslim. They haven't all read the Quran,
Right.
mouth to them, but they've not internalized it. So when the society comes under some stress, people turn back to their religion and they find it in different ways. And someone who's fanatical can quote the worst things to them and rally the activists, and other people are going to a more spiritual type of Islam. And there's a war within the Islamic world, I can tell you, between those who are personal faith and those that want to use it as a fist against society and against their enemies. That will happen here in the Christian West. But we've got a little further to go to be reawakened because we've been desensitized by the whole secular movement, I think.
That's why I am so glad for certain phrases, and this is more than a phrase. Jesus said this word himself. In Matthew 24:14, in the midst of all of this quagmire, in the midst of all this dust storm of political, secular, social, economic protests, religious uncertainty, financial instability, Jesus said, and this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all nations, and then the end will come. If that text wasn't there, I would say, how is this going to wind up? Is it going to happen? Are we going to get to the point of being able to do this?
Well, yes, I think there's some moments of opportunity yet to come.
Right.
But I personally don't buy the idea that there's some mythical moment when everybody will know.
Right.
People are coming and going now, and I think in the satisfactory sense already, the knowledge of Christ has gone to the known world several times over. It went in one lifetime. And with the media now, there could be a moment of test when a true call could sort of flash out.
True.
And I hope that will happen. But basically, we have to work out our own salvation and witness. And Jesus said, remember, he said, it's not given to you to know these things. It's not given to you to know if he'll survive.
That's right.
How it all works out, the dynamics of it, it says God's not willing that any should perish.
Any should perish.
But I think it's abundantly obvious that we're at the end point. That's the real point. And the U.S., founded on great principles, also is arriving at its end point for this experiment. It could morph into a second promise, but very likely, like Rome, when you're financially and morally and societally dissipated, then the dragon comes at that point.
That's right. I want to make sure that our listening and viewing audience has information that they need to get in touch with Lincoln Steed. Liberty Magazine is something that you can make available to your local thought leaders, whether congressional, whether political. If somebody in your community or in the broader effect of your influence needs to make decisions about your tomorrow, Liberty Magazine, Liberty Insight is one that you should have. And libertymagazine.org is where you can go to find out more information. You can find out older editions of many of the issues that we just touched on today.
Back into the 70s even.
Way back into the 70s, Liberty Magazine.
That's when we started electronic type. We can't go further back.
You can't go back further than that, but I think that's, if there's ever a time that political leaders need to read this magazine, you can do your part, and you don't have to say to them, well, here's what you need to pay for it. Make it a gift to your local congressman, to your local senator, to your local mayor, and educate those who are in the position to impact your future. A few thoughts as we wind up this hour. This 2 hours, what an hour. We've covered quite a bit of things.
I know, it goes quick.
Yeah, it goes very quickly. What can you say to those who are listening and watching this program?
Well, I used to listen to HMS Richards, a great radio ministry of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and at the end, in a mellifluous voice, which neither you nor I have, I mean, you have it more than me, he would say, have faith in God, dear friend, have faith. We do need to see that amid the storms, God is protecting and in a limited way, because he's trying to prove a point that evil's working its way out, but God is guiding events.
That's right.
And I was speaking to D. James Kennedy, as I mentioned earlier, and we spoke at great length in his office, and he told me, he says, I used to believe in the secret rapture, but he says, I don't anymore, he says, because under that, God does not clearly win. And God needs to be clearly seen to win. And out of this chaos, I believe God will be seen to be victorious, goodness will triumph,
That's right.
and a new eternal kingdom, not a reborn America, but a reborn mankind and an Eden will appear.
Right. I'll end the program with this thought. Isaiah 46, verse 9 and 10. Remember the former things of old, for I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times, things that are not yet done, saying, I will do all my counsel. You know, thank you so much, Lincoln. It's always good to have you here. Always great to have you here. And friends, we're praying that this time of the year, this July 4th, will bring you a liberty in Christ that you have never known before. Continue praying for us, and we look forward to seeing you again. God bless you.